So this week is another quick video. I've actually been playing email tag with this customer for probably about 6 months. We finally, our schedules connected and I could get this done before the holidays. So what this is this is a chair that was not broken, that she gave me to match a pattern, and the back of the chair that was broken to repair. So like I've said before, I usually don't film these quick repair videos. However, I do a ton of these sorts of chairs. I do multiples a year. They're usually similar breaks, especially with the back, because it's a very thin piece of wood with a mortise cut in it, and it does fall apart quite a bit. So I wanted to film this because a lot of times these chairs don't necessarily have a lot of monetary value. People aren't keeping them because they think they're worth a ton of money, but it's because they're furniture that's been passed down from their certain family members. So people want to keep them. They have sentimental value, and a lot of times getting them repaired can be quite expensive. They're not worth the value of the chair, so people throw them out. I consider this to be a DIY-able repair, something that people that have even a minimal set of tools and a minimal set of skills can get done. So I'm going to show you how I fix this chair. It's going to involve replacing part of the backer as well as re-gluing that top part on that other chair. So like I said, this one's mainly because I'm hoping people can kind of glean some skills from it and save some furniture that they would normally throw out. As you can see, I'm working on a rather large built-in. That will be coming up on the channel, as well as I'm doing a dog crate. I don't know which one I'm going to post first, but after this, the shorter videos will be ending, and I'll be back to bigger pieces of furniture. So like I said in the intro, the reason I'm filming this is because I've done so many of these chairs over the years, and they usually have quite similar breaks, which makes for quite similar repairs. So I'm just hoping that people can, this is definitely a DIY-able project. So instead of paying someone to fix these chairs, fix them yourself. Especially since stuff like this, these chairs aren't necessarily worth a ton of money, but 9 times out of 10 there's something that you got from your parents or your grandparents, so they have sentimental value, and it's understandable that you would want to save them. So what I recommend doing first off is kind of examining the break, figuring a few things out. So she gave me a chair that is not broken, and from what I figured out from this is this was repaired at one point, mainly because you can tell that this is a veneered piece in the middle, because a piece of the veneer is chipped, and there's a routed edge on the front side of the chair. On the piece that was still stuck in the chair, it's not routed, and the repair is solid poplar, which is not necessarily a terrible fix, because as you can see the color match is pretty similar, and it's a cheaper repair. The other thing about these chairs is people don't want to spend a ton of money getting them fixed, which is also understandable. So using a material like poplar, not veneer of a nicer species, is going to be less expensive. The other thing was this has been broken as well. Like I said, this must have been repaired at some point before, because this is a newer piece. And if I take this off, it's a little hard to see on camera, but I could tell that this is maple. So the hardwood of this chair is maple, which makes sense then why poplar would be somewhat of a close match, versus a lot of times these chairs are veneered mahogany. So that would have been a little bit more difficult. So you could see maple, and on this side there's a chip and a dowel. I'll replace that as well. That's probably why it broke again. This was probably just glued back in place, and then it easily snapped off again, and the back broke. So I'll give that a look at. And this one was also broken and repaired. Sometimes you can pop these off, and I might re-glue this joint, but if not, it's just going to have to stay that way, because I don't want to break the inner piece. A veneer repair is also doable, but that's not something she requested, so I probably will not show that in this video. I also do not have a ton. I pretty much have oak veneer in the shop, and that's about it. But so those couple things, knowing that this is a secondary repair, knowing it was repaired out of poplar, it's actually cracked there too, knowing the original's maple is going to be important for stain matching purposes. I went to the store and I got a piece of 1/2 inch poplar. 1/4 inch they do have, but it would have been a little thin for this. But this is also a little thick, so I'm going to have to plane this down slightly. COVID has not really gotten to these. This was like a $5 board. It's going to be a pretty cheap fix. I'm going to start by cutting a piece with about 2 inches on either end, bigger than I need, and then I'll plane it down. If you do not have a plane, you could make this a little bit thicker. You could probably get away with the 1/4 inch, or if you have a saw, sometimes you could take this down, or you're going to have to specialty order or find someone near you that a lot of small wood shops, myself included, if someone has a board they want planed, I will plane it down for them pretty cheaply because it doesn't take a long amount of time for something this size, one board. So I'm just going to start by cutting off an oversized chunk of this on the radial arm saw. Now, like I said, if you don't have a plane in the shop, you can pretty much buy any style of wood of any species, any size, and any thickness. You can get them on eBay. There's a couple sources. Woodworker Source is another one that will pre-plane pieces for you if you don't have a planer or someone who has one to get this to the dimension you need. This was a little bit thicker than 5/16, so my plane doesn't go down that small, which is why you could see I'm attaching it to the cutoff piece so that I could get the thickness higher. Now you're supposed to plane evenly on both sides so that the lumber doesn't warp over time. So I did about 3 or 4 passes on one side, I flipped it upside down, and then you could see I'm using the broken off piece in order to get this down to the correct size. And then before I finish up, I'm just going to test fit it in the mortise. It fits in there. So like I said, this ended up being about 5/16. So I'm using the broken piece to start making my pattern, and then the rest I'm going to have to make on paper, and this is why the customer dropped off 2 chairs. Now there's also going to be a bottom mortise, but you can see it's pretty easy to trace the pattern with the back. So I just lined this up on the broken chair, and I made 2 little tick marks for where that mortise starts, and this is also curved like the top one. So I had to play around with the dimension of that because I didn't really have anything to work with, but I could cut my pattern out, line it up with the piece I did have. Obviously, if you don't have a chunk, you can just make the entire pattern off of the original chair. And then I just rough drew a curve for that bottom part, which like I said, I'll play around with. So for the inner part where you're removing that space, you're going to have 2 holes in order to send whatever blade you're using through, but then this is ready to be cut. Now I'm using a jigsaw because I have one. I mean a scroll saw because I have one. This gives you a nice clean cut. It's easy to get those complex curves because the blade's so thin. Most people will not have a scroll saw. You could easily use a jigsaw. Before I got a scroll saw, anything like this, I cut out with a jigsaw. I just recommend getting a very thin, fine tooth blade in your jigsaw. Now with the scroll saw, you could thread the blade through the holes. On a jigsaw, obviously, you can just stick the blade through and cut out that interior space. So this is pretty self-explanatory. The design's not super detailed, so this was pretty easy to cut out. I like the scroll saw versus the jigsaw because you have a flat table to work on, gives you a nice clean cut. The curve on the bottom ended up being quite similar to one of my scraping bits, so I just used that curve in order to get it to fit in place. There was some trial and error with that, but my pattern was pretty much perfect. I didn't have to cut this down or anything. I could fit the backer back in place, and that's what that looks like. Now, part of the reason this broke was because there was not enough of that dowel still sticking in the chair to hold this together, so I'm also going to replace that. To drill out a dowel is pretty easy. I do this sort of stuff freehand. I start with a smaller bit. If you try and drill out the whole 3/8 of an inch at once, it usually doesn't work. The bit will dance around on you a little bit. So I started with a smaller bit and I worked my way up and I drilled out the dowel that was already in the chair. At some point this piece kind of breaks off because the glue didn't have a ton of coverage, and then I could just drill down into the chair. Like I said, I do this freehand because I could get it pretty straight, but with dowels, as long as you're drilling a consistent hole, it will line up. For the cove cut on the inside, I didn't have a small enough bit, but I had one that had a cove on it. So you can see I'm just going to cut enough to get that cove using this bit. So I used a portion of that bit in order to get the cove, and that worked out pretty nicely. You could usually do this with router bits. If you have part of it that will work, just sink it into the past the fence so it's not cutting the whole detail profile, just the part that you need. And this really sets off that inner backer. This backer part's actually on a chair technically called a splat, but I go with calling it a backer. Can sand it pretty easily. Like I said, that scroll saw gives you a nice cut. There wasn't a ton of sanding to do. I mostly just had to remove pencil and pen marks. So the stain match is usually the hardest part of this stuff, but I had a stain that I knew was pretty similar to the chair, and this customer was not going to be very anal about the stain match because the one that was in there you could tell was not a perfect match. So the one that ends up working is this Mocha. It's a brand called Czar. I also tried a Minwax color, which was a little too white. And you'll see the Minwax I don't love because it doesn't penetrate a ton. It's a fairly transparent color. But that Czar ended up being a pretty close match right out of the can, which was nice. And then I could just glue all of this together. So you can see I'm going to do that dowel. You can see the dowel now goes all the way through the top part of the chair as well into the bit there. I can glue in the splat and then just attach the whole thing. I'm going to clamp it in place. Get some nice even pressure on that, and then for this, before this sets up, I want to remove as much glue as possible, especially on the poplar. I'm using Titebond 3 for this, and if you leave that Titebond on there, it stains the poplar brown, and that will show up in your stain. So you want to remove as much glue as possible. It's easy to get off the surface that's already pre-finished on the chair, but that's what that looks like after it came out of the clamps. These were pictures actually sent to the customer just to kind of give them a progress report. So then, especially where the break was already in the chair, there is going to be some wooden pieces that are removed. So I'm mixing up some epoxy and I'm adding some darker powdered dust that I have laying around the shop. I believe this is actually walnut wood into it. You don't want to add too much, almost to the consistency of peanut butter, and that will fill any sort of gaps I had. There was a little bit on the splat, but it was mostly from the pre-break. I could let that epoxy set up and then just before it fully dries, I chip it off with a chisel so there's not a ton of sanding. I put pre-stain on this, especially the poplar, because it's going to be a fine grain lumber, so it's not going to absorb the stain evenly. The pre-stain really helps with that. And then I can just apply the stain. Now it looks darker, but obviously you're going to remove the stain before it fully dries, and it lightens to a color that's a pretty perfect match. I also get the parts on the chair that I fixed as well. So you can see once that dries a little bit, I'm going to remove it with a rag. You don't want the stain to sit on there too long. That oil will never fully dry, and then it's really hard to get off. And then I put shellac on this. So this is just sanding in between the shellac, and I put 3 coats on there, so I sanded lightly in between 3. I usually don't use shellac on projects because I do a lot of utilitarian surfaces. It's not a very durable finish, but for a chair backer, it's pretty good. And that's just what the finished piece looks like. The stain match is almost perfect, and it looks pretty identical to the original.